All of you, oh, all of you are here because you've obviously seen that we are running an opportunity fund round again this year. And this year we're trying to provide a bit more background information about how we do that to prepare people a bit more for that. Can I just ask everybody that's not talking to mute your microphones as well? We're just getting a bit of noise from somewhere. There's a few people in the waiting room back. Okay, I'll keep an eye on that. All right, sorry everyone, just getting the logistics sorted. Yeah, so look, before I start and go through all of that, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. So for me and Rebecca and Joe, who are here from HQ, that's the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present and recognise their unbroken connection with land, sea and sky for tens of thousands of years. So look, we've got an hour and a half scheduled. I don't think it's going to take that long, but basically what we wanted to do was provide you all with a bit more information about how we operate our opportunity fund. And as I said, we're trying to improve the process around it this year. So we're acting on, comments and feedback that we've received and just trying to make sure that everybody understands what the fund is for, what we can support and what we can't support, what the process looks like and the timeline looks like. And we're trying to be a bit more consistent year to year on how we offer it, when we offer it, and the process that we go through to do that. So basically what we're going to run through today is the purpose of the fund, what the scope of work that we can support using it is, and the process from the point at which a submission is made through till a grant is offered, how to develop proposals and the new form that we've implemented to allow you to develop those proposals. We're going to talk about the requirements around the research data that you may collect in the project or with the infrastructure you enable. We're going to talk about translation. Beck will talk about research data. Joe will talk about translation. So translation obviously is more and more on our agenda at the moment, and we are making translation in scope for the Opportunity Fund, and in fact we're encouraging proposals that have translation as part of them to be put in. We'll look at some of the successful examples from the past, and then I'll talk briefly about the project operation and finance aspects. And we've got time for a Q&A at the end, but if you have any questions along the way, please send those questions either through the chat, and Beck and Joe will keep an eye on the chat and let me know if there's any questions coming in, or else stick your hand up and one of us will notice and jump in and ask. Yeah, and this is the first time we've done this, so hopefully we cover off everything. So look, the Opportunity Fund is something we've been running for, well, not consistently, but we've been trying to do it more or less each year. We've done it 4 times now. And the reason we established it was because we had a couple of projects that we wound down, which created a little bit of extra funds that we had available. And we also get some interest based on the money that we hold once NCRIS pays us. And so we reinvest all of the interest back into the Opportunity Fund. So you'll see a bit later, we never quite know how much money we're going to have available each year, which is a little bit of a challenge, but that's largely due to the fact that we waited to see how much interest we get by the end of the financial year. The first couple of rounds that we had were quite small amount of money available, and we only funded a few projects. But the last few years, it's been a significant program. We've had very, very strong interest from the community, and we've had a large number of applications, which is great, but it does make it very competitive. And I'll touch on that again later. So in terms of the purpose of what we're actually trying to fund, we can only fund research infrastructure, right? So anybody who's been involved in AuScope or other NCRIS programs in the past will understand this, but sometimes it's not that clear. So we can't fund research, we can't fund research activities. We can only fund the development of research infrastructure. But we can be relatively broad with what we mean by research infrastructure. So that can mean national scale data sets, so data as infrastructure. It can mean, the sort of traditional instruments in labs. But it can also be providing access to existing infrastructure. It can be a whole range of things that allow people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. But it has to have a national focus. It can't just be looking at one research group at one university and buying a new piece of kit for them. It has to have that sort of national component to it. So the intention of the Opportunity Fund is to either provide critical linking infrastructure that facilitates new capacity or access to existing geoscience infrastructures, or else to establish pilot programs that determine the feasibility for a larger scale future investment. So the image on the right here from Tobias Stahl from UTAS is a great example of that. This was our GRIT project, which was our geophysical research infrastructure for Antarctica. And it was initially funded as an Opportunity Fund pilot. It was set up as a pilot basically to test that we could show a reason for investing in this in a longer term fashion. It's now got additional funding through the RIP process, the Research Infrastructure Investment Planning process, and is a long-term project for us. So it shows how these pilots that initially start maybe with 1 year's worth of funding can evolve into long-term programs and get ongoing funding, or at least more secure funding for longer periods of time. We assess the proposals, and I'll tell you who assesses them in a minute, but they're assessed against a series of criteria. And I've already sort of mentioned some of these, but basically it has to build or maintain national research infrastructure. So it can be equipment, it can be data, or it can be analytics. So obviously we have some modeling capability that we support through Opportunity Fund. We've developed software. We've developed some analytical tools that sit on web-based platforms. We collect a national data set, and obviously we've invested in equipment. It can also include salaries and people in that, but it has to build that national research infrastructure component. It should be relevant to the downward-looking telescope. So any of you that are familiar with AuScope and have seen our strategy, you should be familiar with the downward-looking telescope concept. If you're not, I would encourage you to go and have a look at the strategy document. Maybe Joe or Beck could stick the link in the chat for me, which outlines what that looks like for us. The project has to have, or the infrastructure that you invest in or develop has to have a demonstrable national benefit. So it can't just be for, as I said, just for one research group or one person or whatever. It has to be something that has national benefit. Now that can be because it's a national scale data set, or it can be because you're providing access to a lab to people from all across the country. You can sort of read that how you like, but it can't, like I said, it can't just be for a small research group. It has to engage more broadly than that. And obviously some of these are pilots, so you might just be showing you might be using this funding to actually demonstrate that there could be a national benefit if we grow the project, but it has to be part of the strategy of the project. It has to be core to the project. It has to promote innovation or translation across either academia, government, or industry, which is kind of everyone, but yep. And Joe will talk about the translation aspect of that a bit later. It has to have broad research community support and a definable user base. So again, we can't just build these things hoping that they will come. We have to show that there's a community that is keen to use it. And again, it can be aspirational in the sense that you can show that there's a community that would love to have this thing. They don't currently have it. And there's ways that you can show that community support as part of the proposal development process. And ideally, although this one is a bit open to a bit more interpretation, but it should have impact relevant to AuScope priority areas. For example, coastal monitoring, critical mineral exploration, Antarctic monitoring, environment and climate, geohazard monitoring, fair data, or outreach. Again, that's pretty broad, but ideally we need to align with those things. And you'll see that we also request information about any alignment with government priorities as well. But I'll talk to you about that when we go through the form. And it's open to anyone at an AuScope member organisation. So that's we've got 24 member organisations at the moment. And if you're not part of an AuScope member organisation, you're still we'd still encourage you to apply, and we can certainly negotiate membership of your host institution should you be successful. But again, I'll touch on the implications of that later. All right, I guess before I go on, are there any questions in the chat, or anybody got any questions about the purpose or scope at this point?
We have one question that we can deal with after translation.
Okay, all right, cool. So the process, basically, we're going to open the Opportunity Fund next week. I think I've got the dates right. Yep, next Monday. And it will close in May. May, sorry. Just getting my head around this. It'll close in May, on the 9th of May. We're going to launch a new funding webpage next week, which we'll send everybody who's attended this meeting a link to once we get it up. We're going to try and get that up by Monday at the latest. And that will have a link through to the Opportunity Fund proposal form, which is now an online form. The funding webpage will also have a bunch of information from this presentation. We'll probably stick a link to this recording on there, I guess, as well. And it will have some additional information relevant to your submission. And it'll also have information about a number of our other funding sources and things that we provide. So basically, once that's opened, we're running a series of these Opportunity Fund information sessions. So this one, we'll probably run another one closer towards the submission date, but this recording will also be available for anybody. We'll probably run just a question and answer session closer to the submission date, but this recording will also be available online. Once we've received submissions, we will review them. The AuScope Science Advisory Panel will first review them. First of all, usually HQ go through them and just make sure that they are all eligible based on that first criteria, which is that it's research infrastructure, not research. We'll then refer them on to the AuScope Science Advisory Panel, which currently is Joe Parr as the chair from CSIRO, Steve Hill from Geoscience Australia, Janelle Kerr from the Geological Survey of Queensland, Janet Hoke from the University of Melbourne, and Rick Valenta from SMI or UQ. And we're also just about to appoint 2 new ECRs to that panel as well, which was approved by our board yesterday, but they haven't been approached yet. So you will find out who they are very shortly, I'm sure. Basically, each of the members of the Science Advisory Panel ranks all the submissions we get, and then makes recommendations to the AuScope board at the June board meeting. And then offers will come out at the end of June, and contracting will start next financial year. Now, it's important to recognise that this is, as I said, a sort of merit-based and competitive process. And last year, I think we had about 55 submissions, of which 11 were funded. So around about 20%, but it's still, it still is a very competitive process. So I won't kid you that it's a shoo-in. If you put in an application, you have to put in a really good application, has to meet those criteria and be competitive. And I've got to say, the Science Advisory Panel, the last 2 years, have commented on the incredibly high quality of all of the submissions. So if you are unsuccessful, it's not a reflection of a poor submission, likely. It's a reflection of the incredibly high quality of all of the submissions that we receive. All right. So what I wanted to do here briefly is run through the submission template. So just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that you will be expected to pull together. So as I said, this is a new online submission form that we've developed. It's a bit more detailed than the templates that we've used in the past. So those of you who have made submissions before will find that there are some additional information that we're requesting. We've got a stronger focus on the user community and demonstrating that there's a user community who are engaged by the project or the proposal. You can upload supporting documentation. So if you can get letters of support, I would encourage you to do so. They will be valued. We want you to think about the translation outcomes. So even if you're not putting this up as a translation specific project, we want you to think about what the longer term translation looks like. And again, I'll let Joe hook to that more. We want you to think about how the data is going to be managed. So if you're creating an infrastructure or creating a data set, an infrastructure that creates data or you need to manage that data. We want you to think about that before you put in the proposal and describe to us how that's going to be managed. We really want you to think about access and governance. So again, as a national infrastructure, what does access look like? If it's a data set, it might just be that it's an open data set and it's available for everybody to use. But if it's a piece of equipment, how is that access going to be managed? How is it going to be ensured that it's equitable and fair access to that instrument? It's not just a bunch of postdocs from one institution where the thing is housed that have access to it. It's genuinely people are able to find out about it and able to put in proposals to use it. And we also want you to think a bit more about evaluation. So how do we assess that this has been successful, particularly in the context of trying to seek ongoing funding or looking at transitioning this into a longer term project? So we want you to think fairly carefully about that evaluation side of things. So if you just bear with me for a second, I'll just jump into the form. You got any questions there, Beck?
No, we don't.
Excellent. Sorry, I should have prepared this one earlier.
It's interactive by choosing. It's great.
Okay, can people see this one? Okay. So once you get the link to the form, there's a bit of background information. Obviously, as I said, we're using the same form for all the different types of submissions that we're receiving. It is important that you select Opportunity Fund here because it does change the subsequent questions based on you putting the correct thing in there. So put in Opportunity Fund. Then there's a series of questions that's just on who it is that's submitting it, where the host institution is. And then we want you to provide a project title. We might work with you on that title if it's successful because we want them to be catchy and kind of groovy so that we can put them on our website and catch people's attention with them. But use a working title for now. A short plain language description. Again, this will just go straight onto our website if the submission's successful. So it needs to be understandable by anybody and describe what the project does. And then the more detailed summary. And this is your opportunity to say what the project is and why it's important. And this is important. This is the bit that really is going to capture people's attention and imagination. So make sure you spend some time getting that bit right. We then ask for some information about impact and translation. So as I said, we're keen on understanding if this aligns with any of the national priorities. So they could be things that are described in the National Science and Research Priorities. It could be stuff from the National Reconstruction Fund or the Future Made in Australia, or any other priorities that you're aware of in your discipline area that are relevant that we haven't described here. So anything works, there's some blue economy documents and things that might be relevant to different discipline areas. We want you to give some information about the impact, the research community impact, so the nature and the size of the intended user community. And as I said, you can provide supporting documentation later in the submission to support that. The potential impact relevant to AuScope priority areas. So I've already mentioned those, but please identify specifically if the submission has anything to do with coastal monitoring, critical mineral exploration, Antarctic monitoring, environment and climate, geohazard monitoring, fair data or outreach, or anything else that you've picked up in our strategy documents that you align with. Feel free to incorporate that here. We want to understand whether this is an innovation enabler and include any potential for future commercialization that you can see. And we also want you to provide a translation plan. So as it says here, briefly outline the plan for ensuring translation of the research outputs. And again, Joe will go through this in more detail in a subsequent slide, so I won't delay here. Then we ask for some information about the deliverables. So what are the objectives at the very highest level? What are the milestones? So these are things that should be SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, and relevant, and time-bound. So they can be things like machines will have 95% uptime. They're things like that. They can be very small, short things. We will engage with 200 users over 2 years or whatever it is, stuff like that. We also want any project deliverables, and you don't have to fill out all of these if they're not relevant to your proposal, but fill out the ones that are. So, what are the things that the project is going to actually deliver at the end, and how will we measure the success of the project? And then what are the outputs or outcomes? So sort of products and services, things that are actually developed and that will outlive the project. Then, and again, look, there's a lot of fields here, so you don't need to write volumes for each one. Just give us a sense of, as succinctly as possible, of your thinking behind these different things. But we want to understand the governance. So, some of our projects have advisory boards. Some of them just have a project leader reporting into AuScope HQ. Just let us know what the governance is around this, and particularly any engagement with the community, how that will be managed, if that's going to influence the way you develop the project as it progresses. How you're going to measure user satisfaction. So this could be putting out annual surveys. It could be piggybacking off the AuScope annual user satisfaction survey. It can be as simple as that. But we do want to understand how that's going to be measured and evaluated during the project. We want to know any risks that you can identify. This could be anything from OH&S risks where you're working in dangerous environments as part of the project. We have projects in Antarctica now. We have projects deploying optic fibers down drill holes. There are risks associated with those. There's also risks of deploying instruments in the field from bushfire or flood, that the instruments might be damaged or lost. In the oceans, obviously, there's issues with instrument loss as well. So we need to know, just again, a brief list of those risks. And if any of them are really significant or severe, please identify that as well. Let us know about any linkages you have either with other NCRIS organisations or with government departments. Some projects provide data directly into government, state of environment reporting and things like that. It's really valuable for us to know of those existing linkages or potential linkages that you hope to develop as a result of this infrastructure. How will access be managed? So many of our projects have access committees where people, if they want to use an instrument, will put in a proposal, and that project will have its own committee that review those. You could also potentially, if it's not an enormous workload, you could suggest that the AuScope Science Advisory Panel or other groups within AuScope, existing access groups within AuScope like ANSIA, could help support the access to those to that instrument or that infrastructure. But please have a conversation with those groups first if you're going to expect them to do it, to make sure they have capacity. Tell us how you're going to promote it, because we don't want to build things that nobody knows about and nobody uses. So we want you to think about that and build that into the budget if you need to. Make sure there's money in there for doing promotion, because we do want to see these things used. And also let us know about any sort of end user engagement that you plan or you think might be undertaken as part of the project. Finally, almost finally, second to finally, around your research data. Again, Beck will talk more about this, but let us know what the sort of data products and software are that might be developed from this project. And you do need to provide a fair data plan. So I'll let Beck talk to that, but you do need to consider how you're going to make the data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We also want you to consider an Indigenous engagement plan for the project. So this is really to understand where you're doing fieldwork in Indigenous lands, how you're going to manage those engagements. If you've got infrastructure that other people might use in those environments, you need to think about how you're going to make sure that those engagements are done properly. And where you're collecting data that is relevant to Indigenous people or Indigenous communities, you need to make sure that you have considered the care principles and how you're going to apply those to your data or your project as well. If there's likely to be any period of restraint on publication of data, let us know about that or how you plan to deal with that. Just as examples, some of our projects allow PhD students to have a period of restraint on the publication of their data so that they can get papers out and their theses finished. But most of our projects have statements around them saying data will be made publicly available and open as soon as is practical after collection of that data. And also let us know if there's any IP that's coming into the project that you need to identify prior to any contracting or anything. Finally, the budget. So at a very high level, I'm not sure if I said this earlier, actually it's on a subsequent slide, but basically AuScope currently has funding through till FY 2028. So end of June 2028. So theoretically, we could operate these projects for up to 3 years, but no longer than that at this stage. We want you, but we're happy for them to just be 1 year as well, right? Like we don't want them to necessarily be 3 years. We're very happy for them just to be a shorter period than that. So this first line is the total amount of money you're requesting from AuScope. The next line is any cash co-investment that you're able to get, either out of your host institution, out of aligned projects, or out of other interested parties. Any income that you intend to get from the project, we virtually have none of that on any of our projects, but we do leave that as a line in the budget, should there be income associated with it. And then we also require that you provide in-kind an assessment of the amount of in-kind co-investment you're going to be getting. Now, often there are questions around what's the difference between a cash co-investment and an in-kind co-investment. There will be some words on this funding webpage that describe that, but the simple way to think about it is it's a cash co-investment if you're funding something that's new that you wouldn't have purchased otherwise with other funds. So if you're putting a mass spectrometer into a new lab, and as a result of doing that, the university who's hosting it has said, well, we'll build the lab for you, we'll build the space and refurbish it. That's a cash contribution co-investment because they wouldn't have had to rebuild that space or build that room or refurbish that lab if it wasn't for this project. So it's a cash co-investment in this project. An in-kind co-investment is where they've given you something that would have existed anyway, but they're letting you use that as part of the project. So if it's an existing room, it's not costing them anything to do it, and you're just occupying it as part of your project, that's an in-kind contribution by the host. Same is true for salaries. So if you're creating a new position that the host or somebody else is fully funding, that's a cash co-investment. If somebody who already works there is going to be fully allocated to work on this project, but they already had a position. That's an in-kind co-investment of their salary. And obviously there can be a combination of the two. So we just need those for each financial year, but then we do also want you to provide a more detailed budget. So if you click on this link, it will download an Excel spreadsheet. This is just looking at it in Dropbox, but you can download this. This top part of the table should match what you put into that form, but the bottom part is just a breakdown of the total expenses and into the different fields that we report against. Don't stress too much about this. Just have a go at it as best you can. We'll iterate on it with you if your bid is successful, but it just gives us a sense of, you know, how much of this is a new piece of infrastructure versus how much of this is salaries. And we can give you advice on how you develop these project plans. Then you use this part of the form to upload that template once you've completed it. You can provide some comments in here if there's something you need to explain that you weren't able to fully explain in that template. And then finally, we want you to have a think about, because these are pilot projects, there's no guarantee of ongoing funding, but we don't want to invest in something that's just going to fall over after 1 year or 2 years or 3 years of funding. So we want you to think about what the financial sustainability plan is for that piece of infrastructure. Feel free to write in there that you're going to seek ongoing funding from AuScope should it be successful, but we would really like you to try to think about how the community could maintain aspects of it, you know, how you, if you're building a data infrastructure, how partners who are involved in that might be able to take on some of the financial operational costs of that thing going forwards. If it's a piece of analytical infrastructure in a lab, make sure that the university who's housing it or the institution that's housing it is willing to house it beyond the 3 years or 2 years or 1 year of funding that you get through the Opportunity Fund. And then absolutely finally, here's this opportunity for you to attach some supporting documentation. And that can be letters of support, or it can be basically anything that you think is relevant to us making a decision around whether this project should be funded or not. In some cases, it might be aligned stuff, like if you've got a Federation fellowship or something that you've put in, or somebody's put in that aligns with what you're doing here, you might just want to put in that proposal or something along those lines as a you know, supporting document. Okay, that's a lot. I do have a couple of other things that I'm going to go back to, but are there any questions while I'm talking about the funding?
We do have one question from Ellie Sanderson. Will the panel be able to give rough feedback on unsuccessful proposals or what might need to be addressed if we wanted to resubmit in future years?
Excellent question. And I think
Just answered yes already.
Almost. Oh no, I will come back to that. Yeah, so look, the answer is yes. We can give feedback on unsuccessful bids. We want to be as equitable about this as we possibly can, about the process. So we can't shepherd people through this process. We're doing this information session in this way so that everybody has access to it. We can advise you on whether something that you want to put up is within scope, whether it's able to be funded through this process. So we can give you advice along those lines, but we can't sort of shepherd through the development of proposals. But absolutely unsuccessful proposals, we can give you feedback on. As I said, though, in the past, it's rare that we've got stuff that has been unsuccessful because it's had problems or issues. It's usually just been unsuccessful because there have been some really outstanding things that have gone up against them. So the answer is yes, in a very long-winded way of saying it, but we'll cross those bridges when we come to them. All right. I'm sure everybody's quite sick of hearing me talk, so I'm going to go back to slideshow and see his slides up next, and it's Bex. So I will mute myself and let Bex speak.
Look at us. Yeah, hi everyone. So just a quick word on research data at AuScope and how that relates to the Opportunity Fund projects. So one of the focuses at AuScope is that we're really interested in increasing the community's capability in research data, data products and software, and it's grounded in three guiding principles that we make sure that the research data, data products and software are aligned with fair, care and open science principles and across all processing levels. So there's kind of a lot to unpack there, but we want to make sure that it's not just the data in the table of your publication that is kept as, accessible and interoperable for the future. It's also the raw forms of data. We're interested in making sure it's machine to machine interoperable, but also we are stepping into the Indigenous data sovereignty space with care data principles and trying to understand how we can support our community in making sure our data is appropriately looked after for Indigenous data sovereignty. And all of that is really foundational to the open science principles that we, as a broad community, all subscribe to. We want to make sure that all of this is at international best practice and/or standard, both within our subdisciplines, but then also at a technical level. So we're making sure the details of things being machine to machine interoperable at a repository level, all the way down to whatever it is that, like the vocabularies that your sub community calls things when it comes to field data. We're also very much focusing on being recognised, for collaborative problem solving and providing leadership and development opportunities. So the reason I'm raising this in this context is that projects can be proposed that are entirely focused on these areas or partially. We have had those in the past. So some examples include, I'll work from the bottom up here in my list. A project that got up in last year's fund was rock dating with Pycron. So that was providing a group of thermochron geochemists access to an open source software package. So the software was open source, but you still need to pay for a license. So that was a relatively small investment on our behalf, but it provided the community access to cutting edge open source software that was also written in Python. That meant it was interoperable with other pieces of software that they used. We also supported a project in previous years to do with heat flow monitoring, and we were able to support a portion of that project in making sure that data got into a new repository that we were setting up. So we kind of brought forward plans, used that project as a test case in the development of the AuScope Research Data Repository, and so that data is now available through that repository. And we also have a project kind of at the other end of the scale where we're working with NCR, the National Computational Infrastructure, and we have a team working to try to make sure that geophysics data that we have collected, so through various state survey co-investments, as well as the AusLAMP magnetotellurics survey, making sure that's available at high performance computing standards, so standards that we're able to use at NCI, but then also going on into exascale computing, etc. So I understand that's a lot of detail, especially for those that aren't kind of into data, but you can see that there's quite a bit of scope for projects to be pitched looking at these specific areas. And you can also see how this does kind of support a lot of the activity or almost all of the activity that AuScope funds as well. Happy to take questions at the end or now, and I'll pass back to Tim.
And I'll pass on to Jo.
Hello, everybody. So I'm excited to see that translation is really making a splash in this round of the opportunity funding. It's our opportunity to really showcase what we can do with our collective creativity in passing the baton on to end users in government, industry, and communities all around Australia towards the national priorities that we have in the Australian government. So we're being encouraged by the Department of Education, our funder, to really back translation initiatives across all of our work. This means converting our instruments, our data, our software, and our knowledge into or towards policy, business, and community outcomes. So it's a really broad brush. If you've got an idea for a project that demonstrates collaborative, responsible, and scalable research translation to address a national priority, let's hear it, please. We'd love to see your submissions, particularly if you're able to demonstrate collaboration in the process of building the submission or for the benefit of end user groups. So let me just talk you through the visuals that we have here, because this really shows you the pathways for translation that we've got. So AuScope, as you know, is a research infrastructure provider sitting on the far left as the hand giving the baton. We're the top end of the research innovation ecosystem. There's sort of no one sitting before us, except for our funder, in some ways that you could look at it. They give us the money, we build the infrastructure delivers all this cool stuff, and we give it to researchers first and foremostly. But we've also got this enormous opportunity to hand it over to lots of other people beyond academia, and the impetus to do so to address national challenges. So just to quickly highlight some of these groups that are in the different sectors here, to show you who it is that we're focusing on delivering value for. So we've got people in government, including scientists and science leaders inside of science and other government agencies, state and federal level. We've got policymakers who are supported by those science communities to deliver policies that benefit all Australians. We've then got place or interest-based communities that you can see in the pink. So First Nations communities, peak bodies who represent lots of different kinds of communities, education communities that includes educators and students at both tertiary and secondary and primary school level. But just note that in schools, we're really targeting the year 10 age group to influence career pathways into earth science. And of course, we have the general public, who is the ultimate funder of AuScope. So people who are living anywhere around Australia, place-based communities and interest-based communities. And then, of course, we have people in industries. And I should note that this is not a lucky last. This is definitely a focus for the government. They really want us to help affect outcomes for mining, people in tech services, consultancies, and the media, which is, of course, a great conduit for public dispersal of all of the knowledge in academia. So they're the people that we really want to deliver value for through whatever creative ways that you can find, even including just getting together to understand what their needs actually are, and certainly not assuming what they could be. So when we're collaborating with these people, we're doing so for any earth science application, which is what you can see up in the top right of this diagram. So that's the Geoscience for the Future poster that many of us are very familiar with. It really showcases that breadth of earth and geospatial science applications in the world. And Australia is, of course, our focus and the region. So if you're looking for some inspiration, that's your first stop, thanks to the UK GL Society for producing that one. That's so valuable, that poster. And then, of course, everything that we do, as Tim mentioned earlier, has to align with national priorities set out by the Australian government in multiple policy documents, but there are a few key ones for us. So there's the NCRIS, and I've posted all of these in the chat a bit earlier. There's the NCRIS, the NRI, National Research Infrastructure Roadmap from 2021. I think it was delivered 2022, and there will actually be another one coming out in the next year or two. But that's our first port of call today. And then, of course, the national science and research priorities. So this diagram in the bottom right that you can see are those priorities for that policy document. And then the Reconstruction Fund and the technology roadmap. So yeah, I might just take a moment to just actually call those priorities out because they really are fresh into the world off the back of Kathy Foley's chief scientist leadership outgoing last year and very wide consultation. So as you can see from the top and working clockwise to the center, we've got priorities around building a secure and resilient nation, priorities around net zero and that transition, priorities to support healthy and thriving communities, protecting and restoring Australia's environment, and at the centre is elevating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems. So yes, if you have any idea to advance translation for us that we can show off to the world, best practice, that being very collaborative, very responsible and inclusive, yeah, we would really love to see it. Maybe you need space and support to collaborate. Maybe you need a website. Maybe you have an idea for an outreach event, an app. We've seen that in the past. Whatever end users want and need to get outcomes is a big tick from us. So yeah, good luck and thank you for that.
Thanks, Jo. And I mentioned earlier that we can't really help shepherd things through, but given that translation is kind of a new area for us or for the community as a focus area, and that Jo has been working in that space for the last year, I think if you need clarification around translation or, you know, what would qualify as a translation proposal, I think Jo would be able to give you advice on that. Okay. So I apologize. I've got two sets of this slide pack, and I noticed that the one that I thought I was presenting to had some information earlier in one of the earlier slides that didn't actually show up. So I'm just going to mention that. In terms of the amount of funding that's actually available, which is obviously important, I said we couldn't really tell you exactly how much is going to be available each year, and that's true. But I can tell you that historically, the smallest round that we've held was around $500,000. The largest round was around 1.5 million. That was last year. And given that the funds are largely derived from interest, as I said, and interest rates are relatively good at the moment, I'm hopeful that we will have a reasonably large pool of funds available for us to use this June. In terms of the actual size of the projects, the smallest project we've ever funded, I think, was around $50,000 and 1 year. The largest project we funded was for 2 years, and it was about $350,000 a year. So that gives you a sense of the total sort of, you know, range. I guess given that we have a significant number of proposals coming in now and a limited pool of funds, we're unlikely to fund those really big projects, you know, in that sort of 350,000 a year for multiple years, unless they're really, really compelling. So, you know, if you've got something that's incredibly compelling, very urgent, I would still encourage you to put it in. But, you know, there is probably merit in aiming for more that sort of $200,000 to $250,000 sort of range. But there's no hard and fast rules around that, you know, as I said. All right. Another thing I wanted to do was just to talk a little bit about some of the existing. So we've funded 27 pilots over those 4 rounds that I mentioned. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will just go through a couple of them just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that have been successful in the past. And I was going to go through one of the actual proposals, but I realized that the form has changed so much that it's probably not that useful for you to see what other people have written in the past because the fields were completely different. But what I will do is just give you a little bit of background on some of these that have been previously funded. So one of them was around making remote sensing data fair. So this was data that was collected by Geoscience Australia. It was data that was very difficult to access. So this was just supporting the development of a platform to allow that data to be discovered. and making sure that the data was fair, that we were delivering, or as close to fair as we could get it. So that was really just a bit of data infrastructure and discovery. I've already mentioned the geophysical research infrastructure for Antarctica. Looking at the photos I've put into this slide pack, you'd think that Antarctica is the only place we're working. That's not the case. We've only been doing projects there for a little while. But the GRIT project is one which was initially a pilot that was to test the application of some MT instruments in Antarctica. It's now expanded to include passive seismic and geodesy instrumentation as well. And as I said, it's become a larger project, no longer funded out of the Opportunity Fund. So it shows you that there is that pathway possible. We have a national heat flow monitoring project. So this is a really good example of where there's a significant investment in some other sort of infrastructure area that we can piggyback off. So this is a project which is in collaboration with the MinEx CRC. And basically, whenever there's a MinEx CRC NDI hole drilled, we have funding available for the team based at the University of Melbourne to go and deploy optic fibers or other heat flow monitoring sensors down those holes and to begin to collect a national heat flow database because of that opportunity that's created by the MinEx CRC drilling that's being done by the state geological surveys. We've funded this marine heat flow measurement project out of UTAS, and that was really a small project. It was only about $55,000, and it was just to acquire a number of these marine heat flow sensors that can be deployed off a vessel and measure seafloor heat flow. And that's just now a pool of instruments that's available for use by scientists that want to use those. The Glacial Collaborative Research Infrastructure, this is also based in Antarctica, but this is looking at deploying observational infrastructure on glaciers to tell us more about how those glaciers are responding to heating and global warming and various other impacts. And that's just sort of showing that, we do have some projects that are on that sort of the edge of what we would consider sort of solid earth science, and providing data set that's critical to influence things like the Access Climate Model and other things like that. Similar to that, we also had a project which involved doing site surveys for Australian critical zone observatories. So this was out of the University of Western Australia. And it was basically providing some geophysical tools to allow them to work out how to build critical zone observatories, which are these observatories that look at basically the ecosystems that live within the critical zone, so the shallow earth, and understand the shallow earth until the top of the canopy, but understand how those critical zone observatories should be deployed by creating a capability that we didn't have previously. The National Argon Map was a different style of project where the funding was used to run analyses on argon machines around the country. So that was centrally operated out of ANU and GA. And people were able to put in submissions saying, I've got some samples that I want argon data for. This is why it's important in a national context. The work was then distributed between a variety of labs from Curtin to Melbourne to JCU to ANU. And the data was compiled into a national data set afterwards. Again, it was aligned with some work that MinEx CRC were also doing in that space. The Atona MIFAS was just an instrument. So basically, this was an instrument that was purchased at Adelaide to bolster their capacity to do analysis relevant to critical mineral exploration. And it's available now for use by the broader research community. It didn't have operational funds or anything. It was just purchasing a piece of kit that was unavailable previously. The Atom Trap Trace Analysis Facility, this is this novel instrument also at Adelaide in the physics department. It's the only one of its type in the Southern Hemisphere. It's this atomic scale noble gas mass spectrometer that allows you to capture single atoms using lasers and measure the total abundances of those. So it's very, very high precision, requires very, very small samples, and it's being used largely in groundwater dating. But this is it's a novel new instrument. So this really is a pilot in the sense that it didn't have a huge user community ready to go because it was hardly even tested yet as a tool. But it had huge upside and potential. So the proposal was very, very well received when it was clear the sorts of things that this could be applied to that you could really do no other way. The AGN was a community, so it was developing this network of labs across the country of geochemistry laboratories and providing data science support into those. So this was really about people, but to support geochemistry data management. The mobile petrophysics lab, there's a picture of it in the bottom right there. So that was taking a core logging device, multi-scanner core logger, and it was containerizing it, putting it into this container so that it could be moved around the country and used at different geological surveys or used at mine sites and in other environments, for example, within the Minex CRC. So it was really taking an existing piece of infrastructure that was underutilized because it was stuck in a laboratory at a university, and it was very expensive to move drill core to the university to operate. So we used the Opportunity Fund funds to containerize it and ship it to where it needs to be used. I also wanted to mention we have one project. These are actually the next two in the list of two separate projects, but they're related. They're similar in the sense that they're providing access to instruments. One is the shrimp at ANU. So we had a project mapping the crust in 4D based around the ANU shrimp. We also had sub-nanoscale critical mineral characterization using atom probe tomography. So that image to the right of it is the atom probe at Curtin. And both of these were really providing funding to provide access to those existing instruments. So the mapping the crust in 4D was focused on research students and providing them, they could put in submissions as to why they wanted to get access to that instrument, and the successful submissions were provided access and were able to run their samples. Same sort of thing for the atom probe tomography, but that was really more about testing different scenarios relating to critical mineral characterization that the atom probe instrument could be used in. Almost to the end of my moderately long list. We have a project, or it was actually two projects, SWACE 2C. Its follow-up project was called the catchy title of Sediment Sampling Beneath the West Antarctic Ice Sheet to Understand Its Fragility. The image on the top there is an image from that project. So this was us buying access into an ICDP project, so an International Continental Drilling Project, program project. So this obviously is in Antarctica. It's drilling through the ice sheet, then through the water column, and then into the sediments beneath the ice sheet to look at what impact the last 2 degrees global warming had on ice sheet stability. It's a 3-year project, but all we're funding really is access for Australian scientists to that program. And it was a pilot because at the time we funded it, the submission was put in through ANZIC. At the time we funded it initially, ANZIC wasn't part of AuScope, and Australia wasn't part of the ICDP program. So this pilot funding was to provide Australian membership to ICDP on a one single project basis. And then finally, and certainly not least, we have a number of outreach projects that we've funded through the Opportunity Fund. So G-Plates in Schools is one. It's an app that allows students to play around with the G-Plates software out of University of Sydney. We also have a Magnetometers in Schools project. We also have a AusGeochem in the Classroom project. So there's a number of outreach focused projects that we've supported along the journey. Oh my God, so much talking. Okay. And thank you, Joe, for putting all those links in there. All right, I think the final slide from me, is really just to give you a sense of how we actually operate these things. So, as I said, ideally these would be 1 to 2 year contracts. The longest we could possibly do is up until June 2028. We cannot go beyond that date on any contracts at the moment because we don't have a contract beyond that. But ideally, the sort of 1 to 2 year time frame is better. The way contracts work is they're between AuScope and the host institution. So that's wherever the people putting this proposal in are based. The proposal can come from multiple people from across different institutions, but you need to identify where the infrastructure will be housed, because that's who we'll have our contract with. And that's where the funds will flow to. The host has to be an AuScope member, as I said before. But if your institution isn't a member, they can absolutely join, should you be successful in your submission. So you don't have to be a member to put in an application. If you're successful, you'll have to become a member. Your institution will have to become a member to receive the funds. And that requires a $5,000 yearly membership fee, which can't come out of the funding we give you. So that has to come from somewhere else. If your institution's an existing AuScope member, then we just do a variation to the existing membership agreement for this new project. The way our funding works is we can only pay in arrears. So once we have a contract with you, we say how much money is available, and then you have to, and look, this might sound scary for those that haven't done it before, but all of the finance departments at the universities we work with are familiar with this approach. So basically, rather than us paying money into an account at the university, you have to invoice us for work that's already been done or things that have already been purchased. So if you buy a piece of equipment, when you get the invoice for it and you've made the payment and you receive the equipment or whatever, you send us the invoice and say, we've done this piece of work, we've bought this piece of equipment, and then we will reimburse your institution for that payment. You need to do reporting with that, and we have a AuScope information management system that we do our reporting through. We do reporting every quarter or when you need an invoice paid. So if you have a large invoice, you don't want to wait till the end of the quarter. You can do it whenever you want and we'll pay it, providing there's reporting associated with that, telling us what milestones you've met and things. And our reporting is done quarterly, but it's only in detail every 6 months. So in January and in July, we have larger reports due. The other 2 quarters are really just tick the box and provide us with your invoicing and say where you're up to on your milestones. Yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. That image there is of the core scan of the HiLogger 4, which is an instrument that we supported the development of. So that's a new sensor that increases the capability of the old AuScope HiLoggers. And so this is a project that was funded between CSIRO, the Geological Surveys, and used CoreScan, a third-party provider, to actually build those instruments. So again, another example of ways the funds have been used in the past. All right, so that's everything that we wanted to talk about. I noticed there's a few questions.
There's a few questions about contributions.
Okay.
There's 3 in a row there: Michael, Laurie, and
are there any guidelines on how much money can be requested? Okay, so I think I've covered the guidelines on how much can be requested. I mean, I've told you what the total funding pool is. We'll leave it up to you as to how big or small you actually want to make that. But obviously, really large projects are not going to be funded. If you have an idea for a really large project that you feel like doesn't fit within this opportunity fund, we'd like to know about it. So still reach out to us and have a conversation with us about it. But yeah, we can't do those really, really big ones. And what are the expectations in terms of co-contributions by other organizations, either cash or in kind? Okay, that's a good question. So anyone familiar with NCRIS projects will know that the intention is always to get one-to-one co-investment through host institutions or other organizations. This funding is a little bit different because it's not really fully funded through increase. It's largely funded through interest that we make. So we have a little bit more flexibility around co-investment, but we certainly want to see, as much co-investment as you can genuinely get in the project, because it shows that there's community, support for it. It shows that there's institutional support for it. So co-investment is really well regarded, but your project won't be dismissed if you don't have that one-to-one co-investment figure in the submission. So that's Laura's question as well.
Evidence of it.
Sorry. Oh, evidence. So look, again, it's sort of indicative. If you can get a letter of support from your partners saying that we intend to provide this funding, that will be very well received. And I would encourage you to try to do that. But if you can't, please just be honest about the level of co-investment that you expect to get.
All the questions.
That's all the questions.
Online.
All right.
Yeah, so that we can throw it open if there's anything else.
I will just get rid of my sharing. If anybody has a question they want to ask, we've still got 20 minutes up our sleeve, so please just stick your hand up or turn your camera off, your microphone off, and your mute off.
Joe's added a question down here.
Shall I read them out?
Yeah, go for it.
But I'd throw them in there unless someone else has got a burning one in this moment. I'll use up some space. So a bit of a left field one. Would AuScope consider a randomized selection process for equally strong submissions? So if you've got
we haven't ever had that issue before. Like, we've always been able, through having 7 people on the advisory panel, ranking them, it's always been pretty clear that there are some that everybody thinks are good. I think rather than a randomized approach, we would probably, or what we have done before is, where I thought we had capacity to fund 7 last year, I took the top 12 to the board, and the board actually funded the top 11 out of those 12. So we, rather than randomizing, we actually just extended the amount of funds available to try to capture them all, because they thought that they were all exceptional.
Well, and my second question is, where would we find this recording online?
We will find a link to this recording online from our funding page.
To be launched on Monday.
To be launched on Monday. Angus has a question. In general terms, which organisations are current AuScope members, please? Excellent question. So I could run through them off the top of my head, but well, we'll try. So UWA and Curtin, University of Adelaide, University of Tasmania, Monash, Melbourne, ANU, University of Sydney, University of Queensland, Geoscience Australia, CSIRO, MinEx CRC, all of the state geological surveys, and a couple of museums, Museum Victoria. I think that's everybody, unless Joe or Rebecca can think of anyone I've missed. Oh, and Deacon. Oh, look, Dan. Deacon Dan's sitting there, and I forgot Deacon. Sorry, Dan.
Very good question.
Yeah, we've got a few new members, so I forgot to include them. But Angus, obviously, your proposal that you've mentioned to me in the past might come in through one of the peak bodies. In that case, look, still put it in. We'll work out how to manage payment should it be successful in the long term. All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, look, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the interest in the program. As I said, if you do have other questions, please let us know, and we will endeavour to answer them as much as we can. Sorry, Joe's got a hand up.
There's one from Rachel.
Oh, yes.
Proposal has changed. Is it still possible to see older applications? Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, look, good question, Rachel. I'll just check with a couple of the proponents. On that funding page, I'll stick a couple of the older proposals on there. But yeah, bear in mind that the actual fields we used to ask for data for information across are very different to the ones we're asking for it.
Tim, I'm happy for
now.
you to share the Earth drone one if you wish.
Okay, thanks, Steve. We'll do that. Excellent. All right, Angus, you've got a question. Hand up.
Oh, thanks, Tim. Thanks for the answer to the previous question. In the slide that Joe presented on translation, looked at the various user groups, etc., and I was just focusing on the area of people in industries, and of course, mining is one of the areas mentioned. Does that mean only mining, or other industries can be considered relevant?
Yeah, I can jump in and answer that question. So the areas that we showed there are the focus for us, Angus, but we acknowledge that there are quite a few other industries that are operating in Australia. So maybe there might be some kind of intersecting ways between another industry and the industry shown, but we would certainly be giving preference to submissions that support our priority industries, because we really have to kind of play in our lane, so to speak. So definitely open to ideas, but with a focus on what you can see.
I asked that question in the context that the way the government's regarding mining and the intersection with smart manufacturing is a consideration. And of course, in the area that we're dealing with, tourism as it interfaces with post-mine land closure is another intersection.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah, is what you're talking about being shared with Tim previously, and I can look at that? Okay, great. Yeah. All right. I'll cross paths with Tim on that one.
Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome.
All righty. No more questions? Okay. Excellent. All righty. Well, thanks again, everybody.